So I guess formally, thank you for coming tonight. You know this already, but we're going to be talking about the kind of historical and up to contemporary connections between policing and white supremacy. Most of you know me, but some of you don't, so I'll just do a brief introduction of myself. I'm Angie Luvara. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at American University. I'm a critical race scholar, which means that I am always looking at how white supremacy is situated in our social institutions. And my specific research is on resistance, really infra-political resistance, which is sort of informal or everyday ways that people resist systems of oppression. I've also got some background working in the legal system, in the Department of Justice, juvenile justice in North Carolina, and then also with young people who are being targeted by the legal system while in like public schools or through mental health and nonprofits. So Sanna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Sanna King. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Mississippi State University. And my research focuses on social justice and youth punishment with a critical criminology component to it. I'm a sociologist and criminologist, and so I focus a lot on what's going on in the juvenile justice system, and my most recent research has been looking at the school to prison pipeline in Hawaii, which is what I wrote my dissertation on. And I've had about 10 plus years experience working with incarcerated youth, both in Hawaii as well as in New York at Rikers Island Correctional Facility. And then I've also worked with foster youth who've aged out of the foster care system and seen some overlaps with, unfortunately, the foster care system and the juvenile justice system doing that work as well. So I have experience as a practitioner and a researcher. And yeah, that's who I am. And I'm in San Diego, which is why it's still bright and sunny right now. So yeah.
Thank you. And
I'm Isatou Jatta. I'm a Black abolitionist feminist organizer from Atlanta, Georgia. I graduated with a BA in psychology and sociology from Georgia State University about a year ago. And there was when Angie was my sociology teacher. I'm currently in BYP 100, our Atlanta chapter. I'm the healing and safety chair for it. In March 2020, at the beginning of quarantine for COVID, my chapter created a mutual aid rapid response to COVID that's called the People's Response Atlanta. My political interests in organizing work centers race, gender, class, sexuality, decolonization, and their intersections of where they all meet. And I center healing and transformative justice in all of my work that I do.
thank you. All right, let's jump in. So if you've had me as a professor, then you might have and probably have heard me say something along the lines of the entire history of oppression is the history of resistance, that, you know, oppression has never existed outside of people resisting oppression. And so as we kind of go through everything, this entire history of policing and the entire history of like white supremacy being in our social institutions, that's going to be a really common theme that we go through. Well, that plus that it's not this linear thing, right? That social progress doesn't happen in a linear way. There's a cycle to it. There's like heavier periods of oppression, there's heavier periods of resistance, and then there's some backlash. And Sanna, did you want to describe that cycle a little bit more?
Yeah, so we refer to this cycle as the cycles of oppression and resistance, because what we see happening, and if you look historically, and you'll see as we talk today about just focusing on the history of policing, you can see that anytime there's a collapse of some type of system of control, there is this period of anomie or confusion during this transitionary period where people don't really know how to act or what the rules are, and some people might engage in deviant behavior, but deviant behavior is pretty subjective. And part of that is because they don't really know what the norms are of society during this time period, and that's why they're in this confused state of anomie. And during that time period, people who are in positions of power who are really committed to racist ideologies and racial hierarchies will try to search for new means to achieve their goals, and will structure new systems of control to maintain oppression. And so we see this cycle happening where there's oppression and then resistance, and this this transition period where people are might feel they've accomplished something with with resisting, and made strides towards, for example, equality. And then there could be a period of backlash or more repression and oppression, and people starting again or continuing to resist oppression. So it's this cycle that we see happening.
Yeah. And then another theme that you'll see as we kind of move forward through this history are really two very connected purposes of policing throughout our entire history. And those two connected purposes are, one, controlling Black people, and then two, defending the property of elite white people. And part of why they're so connected is we have to think back all the way to when slavery was an institution here. Black people were property of elite white people. And also we'll talk a little bit more about how that property extends beyond that, even to conceptually like white women, and defending and protecting white women as is part of defending and protecting the property of elite white people. And then another theme that you'll see is that there have been 4 eras of policing so far throughout our history. They're listed here, but we'll get into the details. And Sanna will really explain them because she's our, resident criminologist. She'll explain sort of what the facets of each of those are. But it's important to know that we've already been through several reforms, big major reforms of policing throughout our history. So reform is not something new, yet we still see these same cycles, number one. And then these same sort of purposes of policing have lasted through all of these different eras and all of these reforms. In terms of, before we jump into formal policing, the first early form of social control here that was kind of organized in any way were slave patrols in the South and curfew laws in the North. And we've got some examples of those laws coming into place down here in this mini timeline, but it's really important to note that these are just examples that after South Carolina and after Boston enacted these laws and acts, other states or colonies at that point followed suit. So this became sort of the standard. And what this did is, one, it means that the earliest form of policing in our country comes from slave patrols. And the way that the patrols were set up were, at first, any white person could serve as a member of a slave patrol, had the right to stop a Black person and ask where they were going, why they were going there, who gave them permission, whether or not that Black person was free or enslaved. And then eventually, relatively quickly, the laws changed to where white people had to fulfill that role. They were required to stop a Black person, ask where they were going, why they were going there, who gave them permission, that kind of thing. And if they didn't, they could actually be fined for not doing that. Not only did they have the ability to stop and question, or the mandate to stop and question all Black people, but they also, the law gave them the ability to punish Black people with violence right there on the spot. So that sort of set up this situation where white people were not only acting as police, but acting as sort of judge and enforcing punishment, right? And all of that is centered around race. So that's super, super important to note, that this is the foundation. This is sort of the pre-formal policing stage in our country. And then we have sort of a cycle of oppression and resistance. We don't hear often about resistance to slavery, but resistance to slavery was happening the entire time that we had slavery here, and everywhere around the world. And so not only did different states pass acts, but our federal government started to get involved. And these acts especially happened after large numbers of enslaved people started freeing themselves by running away, or people were planning revolts. Free and enslaved Black people were planning revolts, both here in what would become the US, or what was the US, and also in different parts of the Caribbean. Anytime we saw a revolt or a planned revolt that got discovered, we see a reaction by our government to sort of protect and reinstate and control Black people and Black people's movements. And so that's what, again, these three are just three examples, but these are, you know, some examples of the many ways that our government sort of reacted to resistance to slavery. So yet again, setting up this system where social control is largely about race, right? And so then we get into a more formal, our first formal era of policing. And Sanna, do you want to talk a little bit about the political spoils era and what sort of the facets of this were?
Sure. Sorry, I have to lay down because my pulled muscle is killing me right now. So if you see me moving around a lot, that's why. I've been injured. But anyway, so the political spoils era of policing, it's an era between 1830s and the 1920s. And this is when the first formalized police departments and centralized police departments emerged in the United States. And the first police department, as you can see on the list here, it was in Boston in 1838. And then shortly after that, other large cities in the North followed suit and implemented police departments. The only place in the South during this time period that, especially prior emancipation, was New Orleans. New Orleans was kind of the outlier, but otherwise it was mostly in the North where we saw the development of police departments prior to emancipation. And what we see is that during this time period, the reason why it's called political spoils is because there was so much abuse and corruption in these newly formed police departments. And a lot of the times the officers who joined the police department, especially if they were higher ranking in some fashion, were appointed by politicians as some type of political reward, and were often used by politicians to maintain power. So they would either break up union strikes, they would use police officers to harass political opponents, or they would use police officers to disrupt and suppress any type of resistance to any type of racism or racialized oppression that people were engaging in any type of uprisings or resistance. So, so you start to really see a lot of racial profiling by this newly centralized police department occurring in the North. I mean, racial profiling had existed prior to the police department and harassment of Black people prior to the development of the police departments, but you really saw it ramp up during this time period as well, especially because of all the abuse and corruption.
And so then we get to another period of this cycle of oppression and resistance. With the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment gets passed, which abolished slavery partially, right? Except for that caveat where it says, you know, slavery is abolished except for as punishment for a crime. And that's really important because that's a piece of how this still can connect all the way up to today. So we've never fully abolished slavery. And then Same year, so this is an example of that backlash. Same year the 13th Amendment is passed, the KKK is formed in Tennessee. And then 2 years later, the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 is passed. And that allowed our federal government to, it's essentially divided the South into 5 districts, and they sent military into those 5 districts to enforce federal laws about, well, one, enforce the 13th Amendment, and then enforce voting rights and other things throughout this period of Reconstruction. It's important to note, because sometimes Reconstruction gets talked about in this way that everything was great for this 12-year period, and that's not how it was in real life. There were some great strides made, and the federal military being down in the South enabled Black people to vote, and to vote Black people into state and federal Congresses and House of Representatives. But also it was like extremely violent and an extremely contentious time in the South. So it was this period of both social progress and backlash, and you saw them both sort of happening at the same time. And then we get into this period of redemption with the end of Reconstruction. And I have question marks around the end date, because sometimes people talk about it being ending as early as 1891, but others talk about it as lasting all the way through Jim Crow up to the Civil Rights Movement. This backlash to the progress that was made during Reconstruction. What ended Reconstruction was that we were essentially on the brink of another civil war. And so Congress informally, and the president informally agreed to the Compromise of 1877, and then in 1878 solidified it formally by passing the Posse Comitatus Act, which removed federal troops from the South and enabled Southern states to enact Jim Crow laws that restricted Black people's movement and Black people's ability to vote and lots of different things. And you might have heard the Posse Comitatus Act recently, because it's been talked about in the past few weeks, because what it did was essentially make it illegal for federal troops to enforce laws in our country. So it's been talked about in the past few weeks because there's been, talk and threat of we're going to deploy troops into different cities across the country to like control this uprising. There is a loophole though, that if they conceptualize this uprising as an insurrection, then they can deploy federal troops onto our own land. And so that's why you might have heard it talked about in the past few weeks, and why we wanted to include it here. And another really important thing that happened during this time is in 1880, the practice of convict leasing peaked. It was being used more, or the most throughout that it's ever been used throughout our history. And convict leasing was what Douglas Blackman calls slavery by another name. So this practice utilized the 13th Amendment caveat that slavery was abolished except for as punishment for a crime. And it utilized the Jim Crow laws that severely limited Black people's movements and behaviors and voting rights and things like that to essentially recreate slavery. So what happened was, Jim Crow laws are sometimes also called Black codes, and they vary state by state, but one example would be, if a Black person was walking down the sidewalk and a white person was standing on the sidewalk, the Black person was expected to get off the sidewalk. And if they didn't, that was illegal and like an arrestable offense. And that's completely on the word of the white person. So they could arrest that Black person and then immediately sort of get them involved in this convict leasing system upon their conviction, where they would lease them out to different businesses to work. There weren't prisons on a large scale through the South before the end of slavery, and there weren't at this point either. They just would instead lease people who were convicted out to different businesses, and a lot of times they were plantations, the same plantations that were in existence during slavery and used the labor of enslaved people, or mines, especially in the Southern Appalachians, like in North Georgia and North Alabama. And this was supposed to be for a set period of time, like for that person's sentence. But Blackman, when he was researching it, found out that there were, companies would sell one person's lease to another company, and people would get pulled into this system, and then their families didn't even know where they were. And it was really hard for them to get out of the system. It was also extremely violent, and the death rates were extremely high. And Douglas Blackman estimates that like hundreds of thousands of people experienced convict leasing through the entire time that it was a practice in our country. It peaked in 1880, but it lasted formally until 1928. Alabama was the last state to outlaw it, but it actually lasted informally up until the 1940s. And then some argue, like Blackman and Michelle Alexander argue, that that was the precursor to mass incarceration. So it still sort of exists today, and the prison industrial complex, but just like in that different way, like it's changed forms a little bit. Sanna, did you want to add anything here?
No, I think you covered it for the most part.
Okay, well, do you want to talk about the reform era of policing then, explain what that's looking like?
Sure. So the reform era of policing was when the police department started to formalize their recruitment strategies and policies. And if we think about what was going on contextually during this time period, we had the Great Depression from 1929 to 1941. There was Prohibition from 1920 to 1933. And a big reason why alcohol was made illegal and then was legalized again had to do with white elites wanting to continue drinking and didn't want to get in trouble with the law because they were getting in trouble with the law, and also looking at who was engaged in bootlegging. And there was an incredible amount of violence happening during that time period because alcohol was an underground market, and to regulate underground markets is mostly done with violence. So that's one reason why you saw Prohibition end and alcohol became legal again to consume. We also see the continuation of Jim Crow laws during this time period, and violence as well as resistance to violence continuing throughout the South as well as throughout the country. And also need to consider that during this time period, there was World War II that had occurred as well as ended, and there was forms of resistance such as the Red Summer of 1919, and there was also mass forms of violence through lynchings that continued through this time period, as well as the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, which was one of the only times the U.S. government has dropped bombs on U.S. soil, and they attacked Black Wall Street and destroyed this thriving Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Isatou can probably fill in a little more about that. But what we also saw was great migration from the South to the North, where people were trying to flee racism and racialized violence and vigilante violence, and during this time period, and were seeking safety in the North End as well as the West. But they were unfortunately met with violence in those areas as well, and different forms of violence and systemic racism. Because what we started to see were newer police departments, such as the Los Angeles Police Department, recruiting people with racist ideologies and white supremacists, especially from the South, because they wanted to have that type of ideology in their policing tactics, and people who practiced and believed in white supremacy and racist violence. So that's one reason why the Los Angeles Police Department has such a deep history of racial profiling and violence towards the Black community and brown communities of Los Angeles. Isatou, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so about the Tulsa massacre, so that entire thing started because 19-year-old Dick Rowland was accused of sexually assaulting a 17-year-old white girl. And earlier, Angie talked about how with Black codes that white people were not forced, but if they didn't police Black people, that was illegal. Though that wasn't the case at this time, that mindset of policing Black people continued. And during this time as well, and what is still happening, is that white women will tell lies about Black men assaulting them. For example, trying to think of it. Angie, you discussed it earlier. I don't know why it's blanking my mind.
Amy Cooper?
Yeah. For example, Amy Cooper, who, do you want to talk about it and then I'll talk about Tulsa?
Sure. So y'all have probably seen this as well. It was, I don't know, in the past 2 to 3 weeks. I think time is, hard to like understand right now, but the video that went viral of the white woman it was filmed by a Black man who was bird watching in Central Park. And Amy Cooper is the white woman who he just asked her to put her dog on a leash, which was the requirement in this space in the park where they were. And she, in the video, is screaming at him, I'm going to call the police on you, and I'm going to tell them that a Black man is attacking me. Right. And so why Isatou brought this up is because it's not something that's this isolated event, right? It happened in Tulsa. It's the precursor to Tulsa. It's the precursor to the death of Emmett Till, the murder of Emmett Till. And I'll explain a little bit more about the patterns of that and with Ida B. Wells' work after you sort of explain what happened in Tulsa, Isatou.
Yeah, so that was kind of the catalyst for white people in Tulsa, white people near Tulsa, Oklahoma, burning down Black Wall Street. There was, whenever, Angie's going to talk about this later, but whenever Black people, open up a business or get even just a little bit of money or capital, there's always a pushback from white people in the system. So Dick Rowland being accused of sexually assaulting a white woman was just a catalyst for what white people around Tulsa already wanted to do. They wanted to destroy Black businesses. They wanted to destroy, areas that Black people had taken so much time and effort to build up. And that's when riots started happening in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the people of Tulsa, they were armed and they're actually putting up a good fight against all the white mobs that were coming in. And what really ended it and murdered so many Black people was our federal government dropping bombs on that land and completely destroying Black Wall Street. And after Oklahoma made a law that you can't rebuild on burnt land. And so the people of Tulsa who survived weren't able to rebuild their businesses and had to move to other places. And the history of Tulsa is why Trump, having a Juneteenth, which is such an important holiday for Black Americans, having a Juneteenth rally in this city on that day is so disgusting and disrespectful, because Tulsa is such an important part of Black American history, and so is Juneteenth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what happened in Tulsa is this a part of this larger pattern that Isatou mentioned and I mentioned earlier as well. And of these 4,400 lynchings that occurred between Reconstruction and World War II, the majority, but not all of them, but the majority happened in the South. And Ida B. Wells was doing research on this while it was happening, and she found that there were two main precursors to lynchings, and it was, as Isatou mentioned, economic success, Black people gaining any semblance of economic success, and white women claiming that Black men sexually assaulted them, which was almost always a lie. And that ties in with the idea that we mentioned at the beginning about slave patrols being to defend white people's property, and white women being also seen as white people's property and being needing to be protected to protect white supremacy. And it's really important to note that with these lynchings that occurred during Jim Crow, that they were not separate from the legal system, that it was both vigilante violence, but it was also connected to the legal system. So Sanna mentioned that police departments would recruit people with like racist and white supremacist ideologies. So there's proof that especially in the South, but across the country, that police departments, that local jails would coordinate with white people in the community to either let them know exactly when they would be releasing a Black person from the jail, so that they would be met with an angry, violent mob as soon as they walked out the doors, and no protection. Or even go as far as to leave doors open and unlocked, and cell doors open and unlocked, so that white mobs could come into jails and pull Black people out and meet them with violence. There's also evidence of judges and lawyers being members of the KKK and coordinating lynchings. And there's even evidence of newspapers and journalists being involved as well, because they would work with the local police departments and these vigilantes to make sure that they were there to be able to take pictures of the event when it occurred, so that they knew that they could get the story for the newspaper. So Ida B. Wells said, we've got two options here. We need to either move or arm ourselves. And over 7 million people did move out of the South through the Great Migration during this time period. And many more stayed and did arm themselves. And that's what we saw with the Red Summer. And that's what we saw with, as Isatou mentioned, in Tulsa. And we saw organizations like the Deacons for Self-Defense popping up, where they were armed Black people who would coordinate with each other and had like a community network to be able to protect and support each other from this violence. And so it's really important to note, and it's back to our themes, that it's not only happening through formal policing, it's also still continuing, even though we've established and now reformed once formal policing, it's still continuing through white people who are not actual formal police officers as well. And that is being protected by the legal system. And so then we get into yet another cycle of oppression and resistance during the civil rights movement. Again, there's a lot of progress that happens during this time period, and there's a lot of backlash that happens during this time period. Lots of different organizations formed to push for social change, particularly around dismantling white supremacy and pushing for change within our social institutions. At the same time that our federal government set up COINTELPRO, which is one of the things on this long list that doesn't even begin to cover what all of the things that happened during this time. But Isatou, do you want to talk a little bit about COINTELPRO and how that functioned and what it did in terms of different organizations, especially organizations focused on anti-Blackness?
Yeah, so COINTELPRO was an FBI program that was explicitly set up, and they've stated this, and there's been forms found about this, but it's explicitly set up to dismantle and disrupt activists and radical programs that were focused on liberation of Black people, liberation of Native people, liberation of Puerto Rican people. So COINTELPRO had a couple of tactics that they would use the most to dismantle and disrupt these radical organizations like the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement. So they would infiltrate them. They would use illegal violence towards them. They would use psychological warfare. So For example, while MLK was in jail, they would send letters to him telling him to kill himself and to commit suicide. And they would also use the media to create falsified information about them to turn the communities that these movements were working with and for, to liberate them, to try to, the FBI would create things to turn the communities against the organizations and the movements, to illegitimize them and to illegitimize the work that they were doing. So on this list, in 1969, it talks about the Chicago Police Department killing Fred Hampton. So Fred Hampton was a 21-year-old Chicago organizer in the party in Chicago, and the FBI had an informant that infiltrated the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and that informant spent a lot of time at one of their main houses, where the majority of the members of that chapter of the Black Panther Party lived and stayed, and they would have meetings there as well. And that informant had spent so much time there that they had drawn out a full layout of that house and gave it to the FBI. And the FBI worked with the Chicago Police Department to create a plan on how to raid this house and to how to specifically kill Fred Hampton. So when they went in on a day in 1969, they knew exactly what room to go into, where he would be sleeping, and they murdered him while he was in bed with his pregnant girlfriend, and he was only 21 years old. And there was the FBI would work with police departments across the country wherever these movements, wherever these organizations were based. And the majority of the Black Panther Party from the 60s were murdered by the state. So either police departments, the FBI, vigilantes who thought they were doing justice, and that justice is protecting white supremacy and protecting their place. They're either incarcerated or select few have fled. But the majority of the Black Panther Party, that party was completely disbanded by the FBI. And Angela Davis, who was and is a massive leader who has really created a lot of work for abolition and abolition of the prison industrial complex, was incarcerated in 1970 on 3 accounts of murder and for conspiring against the United States government. And Sanna, do you want to talk a little bit more about the media and COINTELPRO and the Black Panther Party?
Sure. So this image on the slide is an image of Angela Davis in court while she was fighting for her freedom and her innocence. And this image was the cover of Life magazine, and it was so powerful because, one, Angela Davis was a freedom fighter, an abolitionist, she still is, and 2, she was the first woman to ever be on the FBI, to be #1 on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. And as a Black woman, that says a lot in terms of systemic racism in the United States. And this image of Life magazine, where the media, it just shows how the media was one of the many tools that throughout history in the United States has contributed to the criminalization of Black people. Because as you can see in this image, she is wearing her hair in a natural, beautiful afro that was a symbol of the Black Power movement. And there's a caption that says, "The making of a fugitive." And the expression on her face also, without any context surrounding this image, makes it look like she's evil and criminal. However, she's in court fighting for her life in many ways and her freedom. And so it's a way of criminalizing Black people, criminalizing Black women, and criminalizing symbols of Black power and beauty, such as women and men who were wearing their hair natural in afros. And so the media has been a tool to criminalize Black people in the United States for centuries. And this image and the role of the media in criminalizing Angela Davis was so powerful during this time period. And in many ways, it continues to be so. She was supposed to receive a really honorable award. I don't remember from what organization last year, and they pulled it because of the work that she's done in the Black Power movement and the Black freedom movement, and as an activist and anti-racist. And then they realized, with all the backlash they received from people telling them how them pulling that was racist and not giving her the much deserved, well-deserved award and recognition for her work, that they were being racist. And then they tried to reinstate it, and it didn't go over very well. So it just shows the role and the power of the media of continuing to criminalize a woman who has done so much for the Black community.
Absolutely. And then another really important thing to remember, or to kind of point out during this time, is that there were several long periods of resistance specifically to police brutality. I mean, we all know many of the things that different organizations during this time were pushing for in terms of changing, laws about voting and laws about education, et cetera, but the Watts Rebellion in 1965, the Long Hot Summer in 1967, there were many more instances of resisting specifically police brutality. And so we really wanted to bring that up to show that not only is there a long history of resisting like white vigilante violence through Jim Crow during slavery, but there's also a long history of resistance to police brutality as well. And it's really important to note that during this time, when the Watts Rebellion was going on, just before the Long Hot Summer, in the middle of the civil rights movement, is when the first SWAT team was established. It was established in Philadelphia in 1965. And this really sets the precursor for police militarization, which is coming soon. One more thing I quickly want to point out here is that this last little bullet point on the timeline, in 1973, members of the American Indian movement they occupied a town in South Dakota that was on I believe it's Pine Ridge Reservation, and they occupied that space for 71 days, and they had some demands from the federal government with what they wanted that basically revolve around adequate food and shelter and things like that. And a little bit over 50 days in, well, first, the federal marshals and the National Guard cut off electricity and water to the town quickly into the 71-day occupation. And then they cut off food supplies, so trucks bringing in food and things like that. And so then over 50 days in, they told them that they would they were going to do a food drop, and it was like over 2,000 pounds of food, I believe. And they basically lured them out under the guise of this food drop and then opened fire on them. And so I wanted to put this in here because it's really important to note, we all have been seeing people over the past few weeks, talk about, well, the last time, the National Guard was brought out was Ferguson or Baltimore, and these uprisings that were in 2014 and 2015. And while the National Guard was brought out during those times, the last time was at Standing Rock, which was on a reservation in North Dakota, which is part of the same tribe, though also Lakota land. And they were defending their land trying to defend their land from an oil pipeline being put through it. And that was a more recent example of the National Guard and even our military being brought out and utilized against, our own people. And so then, Sanna, do you want to explain sort of what occurred here with this shift in this idea of, or to this idea of governing through crime?
Sure. So, during the mid to late 60s and early 70s, we started to see a shift in concepts of crime, and part of this had to do with a backlash against the progress being made with the civil rights movement, and that came through what Jonathan Simon has considered and called governing through crime. And so to understand governing through crime, it's important to first understand what governing and governmentality is. And it draws from Foucault's concept of governmentality. And this involves the way that people internalize norms of control and surveillance, and the norms of control through surveillance. And so what governing through crime refers to is Simon's argument that the 1960s war on crime became a central framework in the governance of many different institutions in the United States. And this ranged from the criminal justice system to mental health institutions and healthcare to education and even into the private lives of the family. And so we saw how this new form of governance and this concept of governance, which was a process of exercising control that makes and administers social and political policy, how it derived and was based out of using fear of crime as an overarching rationale. And if we use schools as an example of one of the institutions where we saw new concept of governing through crime occur and the use of fear of crime occurring, we've seen that schools have tightened control around students' movement in and out of schools and anybody's movement in and out of schools. We now see schools being fenced in and gated. Students are required to wear or have their student ID cards visibly available. Some schools have instituted policies of students can only bring clear backpacks in. So some schools have metal detectors and surveillance cameras and police officers in schools, but no school counselors. So it's this new process and ideology of using fear of crime. And we also see it in our daily lives in terms of the family and how we've internalized these norms of surveillance where people now, not everyone, but a lot of people now live in gated communities and or gated apartment buildings where you have to go through some type of gate that is designed to keep criminals out. You see bars on windows. People now lock their doors. And prior to the late 60s, early 70s, people did not always lock their front door or of their home or their cars. And we start to see this shift towards victim blaming as well, where through governing through crime, there's more responsibility placed on individuals to protect themselves and to protect their property. So it takes away some of the responsibility of law enforcement. But during this time, you also see more of a militarization of the police that we'll talk about shortly. But it's this shift in the ideologies where we start to see also politicians using tough on crime stances and the emergence of the war on crime and the war on drugs and all of that occurring during this ideological shift and new forms of control that functions through also individuals normalizing surveillance, where we don't question surveillance anymore. We go to the airport, we don't question going through TSA metal detectors and surveillance. Where when I was younger, when you flew, you could just walk straight to the gate, or your family members could meet you at the gate when you arrived without requiring a ticket and going through security. That's not a norm now. The norm is surveillance. and oftentimes we don't question it. So yeah. Go move on to the next slide, I guess.
I just want to mention quickly also that tough on crime stance from politicians, this is when it kind of became the norm that you would hear that no matter what party a politician belongs to, and that you almost would have to hear that from any politician of any party for them to be taken seriously at all. That's how normalized it became. We expect it, across all political ideologies. And so then, Sanna, do you want to explain sort of the facets of community-oriented policing, and especially I think the difference between what it was supposed to be on paper and what it was in reality?
Right. Yeah, so again, we see a reform in state power where not only are we seeing this shift towards governing through crime ideologies, but we also see shifts again in policing. And what we see was an implementation of community-oriented policing, where they wanted police officers to be in the community more, out of their cars, walking around the community, getting to know the individuals living in the community, and as a way of trying to build those bonds so that they could more effectively control crime and quote unquote protect and serve these communities. However, that backfired because what we see is new forms of policing tactics, such as stop and frisk, that have emerged. Instead of help to protect and serve the community, we see police actually terrorizing the community and not bonding with the community, but rather breaking bonds with the community. So we've seen that on paper, community-oriented policing sounds like a great tool, but in practice, it did not come out, and it did not emerge in the way that it was intended to. There have been some police departments that have really tried to go back to and really actually implement community-oriented policing. Camden, New Jersey, I think it's Camden, New Jersey.
Yeah.
They're really trying to implement community-oriented policing in the way that it was intended on paper. So it'll be interesting to see if it actually emerges, or if you just see new forms of oppressive policing tactics, with police engaging one-on-one with citizens more frequently. Because it's similar to what was happening during the 1970s as well. So not only were we seeing this shift to tough on crime rhetoric and governing through crime ideologies and practices, but we also saw other reforms occurring that were seen as more rehabilitative types of ways of addressing social issues rather than punitive. But what we actually saw occurring was a shift from rehabilitative to punitive during this time period. And deinstitutionalization was another example of a policy that sounded great on paper, but in practice didn't work. And deinstitutionalization was the closing of public mental health facilities because there was so much corruption and abuse occurring in for people who were admitted and detained in mental health facilities. And so the ideology and the practice and the policy was that if we close these facilities, we can use funding to go towards building community centers and community resources to treat mental illness. But what they didn't factor in was a lot of the people who were severely ill with severe diagnoses were unable to, did not have some of the skill sets required to get services at these centers, such as keeping appointments, getting themselves to, or resources like transportation to get themselves to their appointments, or remembering to refill their medication. So not only did they not take those things into consideration, but there also was not enough funding to open up enough centers to meet the demands of the number of people who needed mental health services. Also during this time period, we saw deindustrialization occurring, where factories were closing down in many of these urban centers, and we saw a spike and a huge increase in unemployment of blue-collar workers, and a lot of people were struggling financially to make ends meet. This picture on the slide is an image of what was happening in the Bronx in New York during this time period, where because of deindustrialization, where there was mass layoffs and unemployment was on the increase, a lot of landlords were burning down their buildings to try and get insurance money and then blaming it on Black residents in their building. And so this image is an image of what the Bronx looked like. The Bronx looked like a war zone in many ways because so many buildings had been burned down, and a lot of people lost their lives because these weren't planned in advance or had no advance notice. And so they would set the buildings on fire while the residents were in the buildings. We also had the Vietnam War occur during this time period. And President Nixon, who coined the term and coined and started the war on drugs, what was interesting was that he was really adamant about fighting this quote unquote war on drugs and war on crime. But he was such a proponent of the United States participation in the Vietnam War that when a large number of Vietnam vets, when they returned from war, were addicted to heroin, the Nixon administration funded and developed the drug methadone to treat heroin addiction. And part of that was to save face for the reason for Vietnam War and to show that they were taking care of the veterans of this war. But Nixon also really hated hippies, and so he severely criminalized marijuana use because that was a popular drug amongst hippies, especially white middle class and working class quote unquote hippies. But we saw that when a lot of people who were in positions of power, when their children started to get arrested because of these really repressive laws around marijuana, we start to see some relaxing of the policing of marijuana use, and in some states, the relaxing of laws that became less punitive towards marijuana use and possession. And all of this was part of the war on drugs as well. And yeah, does Angie or Isatou want to add anything?
I think I want to add something that also segues into this, the second or the next phase of the war on drugs with Reagan, and that is that the deindustrialization that you were talking about, and basically that was a time period when our government loosened corporate restrictions on importing. So companies moved their factories overseas where countries that didn't have the same minimum wage laws that we do, so they could utilize less expensive labor and increase their profits. And so with that, what Sanna was talking about creating these mass spaces of unemployment, that occurred because our city centers, a lot of the factories at that time were located in city centers, and then the working class people who worked the lower wage jobs in the factories lived right around it. And so when that factory left the city center, then those neighborhoods became what we call economically isolated. They didn't replace those jobs. If you think about factory jobs, you can get it with not even a high school diploma, or maybe a high school diploma. It's stable. It's obviously not, a great paying job, but it's stable and there's some benefits to it. And we didn't replace those jobs with anything that's similar. There's nothing like that you can get now with not even a high school diploma that has benefits and is a 40-hour-a-week job and that kind of thing. And so to me and to many researchers, it's not a coincidence that these are the same communities that then were targeted with the war on drugs, particularly Reagan's version of the war on drugs, right? Because under a capitalistic system, you can't have people that are sort of extraneous to the labor force, but we didn't replace those jobs that they had with anything else. But if we target them for incarceration and then figure out how to make money off incarcerating people through the prison industrial complex, that then involves them still in our economic system, and they're no longer economically isolated in that same way. So Sanna, do you want to explain the Iran-Contra affair and sort of how that enabled this as well?
Sure, yeah. So as Angie mentioned, these communities that were affected by industrialization, they were struggling financially and economically. And during the same time period, we saw, and as we transitioned into the 80s, we started to see a new drug emerge in many of these communities that were impacted by deindustrialization, and the connection between these drugs as well as street gangs and the youth violence epidemic, quote unquote, that emerged during this time period as well and went into the mid 90s, that led to a lot of policies that targeted young people, especially Black youth in the 80s and early to mid 90s. And so the Iran-Contra scandal occurred in the mid 80s, or was at least revealed in the mid 80s. And that was, there was a war in Nicaragua, and it was a civil war occurring where the U.S. got involved because they were fighting. The Civil War had to do with politics in terms of communists trying to take over Nicaragua. And as many of you are probably well aware, the United States views communism as a very evil entity and political process, and didn't want communism to exist in Central America, and got involved in that war. And so they approached Congress and asked for money to buy weapons and military gear from Iran to give to the Contras to support them in their fight against communism in Nicaragua. The Congress denied the request, and so some of the higher ups of the U.S. government and the CIA went around Congress and found a new way to fund their support for the Contras and fund purchasing these weapons. And that was to bring cocaine into the inner city and teach and develop this new drug of crack cocaine. And Mike Davis, a historian who especially has done a lot of work looking at the history of Los Angeles, he refers to it as the new reemployment plan for the inner cities in Los Angeles, where a lot of gangs became involved in this new drug trade and this new underground market. And part of what they also saw was weapons such as guns and ammunition were also became really inexpensive and accessible for these gangs in especially Los Angeles and other communities throughout the United States that were having similar challenges. And so with the access to these new weapons at low cost and money in these communities, you did see money in terms of from the underground market that was introduced by the CIA. You start to see an increase in violence, and that gave an excuse for really militarized tactics of policing to emerge, especially in Los Angeles, with tactics such as Operation Hammer, where they would go in with no-knock warrants, and they would pretty much bust down people's homes and search and seize everything in these homes. And so the Iran-Contra scandal emerged, and only one political official was convicted of treason, of going around Congress by doing this, and that was Oliver North. And Oliver North, it was found out that he had his secretary shred a lot of documents, as well as other people's secretaries shredding documents to hide their connection with the Iran-Contra war, because this was before the wonderful technologies of computers. And Oliver North ended up having his conviction repealed and overturned, and he's no longer a convicted felon, and became a reporter on Fox News for some time. I don't think he works on Fox News anymore, but he was, he had his own show on Fox News for a while. But also you can see privilege coming into play, because during this time period, President Reagan, he was involved in this, and he spent millions of dollars paying for legal counsel to make sure that he could protect himself so that he would not be charged with treason in any way, shape, or form, and removed from office. So all of that was occurring. We saw how it impacted these communities that were already severely struggling from deindustrialization and unemployment, and this economic recession occurring during this time period. And the violence that increased in these communities, as well as the influx of drugs that came in thanks to the CIA, increased all these military tactics and different drug laws that were targeting these communities, especially Black people. And so you saw systemic racism in many of these cases. And Angie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, one thing I think it's important to note is that in 1982, when Reagan declared his version of the war on drugs, drug use in our country was on the decline. And so there wasn't a lot of support for this massive war on drugs that he was proposing, both among the general population in our country, but also among police departments. There were many other things going on that everyone was more concerned about. And so in order to get police departments, obviously, if you want them to engage in a war on drugs, you've got to incentivize it if they're not really that into it. And so some of the incentives that they created revolved around funding. And there were two sort of components to that. One ties in with this militarization that Sanna will explain more in a bit, but they made it so that local police departments could purchase at extremely discounted rates military grade equipment straight from the Pentagon, and as long as they were claiming to use it in this war on drugs. And then the other thing that they did was, and this specifically happened with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act amendments that they made in 1984, they made it much easier for local police departments to engage in civil forfeitures. Specifically, they made it so relaxed that if a police officer, and this still stands to this day, if a police officer just says they think you did something, or your behavior suggests that you are involved in using or trafficking or selling drugs, even if they find no drugs on you, if they just mention that, they can confiscate everything that you have on you, cash, your car, any other property. And it's a civil forfeiture, it's not in criminal court. And so what happens is, so say a police officer pulls somebody over and they have like $1,000 cash and they're on their way to get a money order to pay their rent. The police officer can say, no, quote unquote, normal person just carries $1,000 in cash around. You must be a drug dealer. So now I get your money and your car. And in order to get it back, you have to go into civil court to challenge it. And civil court, unlike criminal court, does not guarantee you a lawyer. So you have to pay for your own lawyer and you have to pay all the court fees. And most of the civil forfeitures cost less than the cost of a lawyer plus court fees. So most of them go uncontested, even when they're completely unfounded. And so police departments literally now build in civil forfeitures into their budgets, to where that they have like a target to meet each year to balance their budget out. Chicago Police Department had $72 million brought in through civil forfeiture between like 2009 and 2016. And so these are huge portions of police department budgets, although police department budgets are very large, which Isatou will talk about in a little bit. But that incentivized local police departments to engage in this because they get to keep both, they get to kind of split it between them and the state. Almost all of the money that and property that they obtain. And they can even take the property and sell it. So if you hear about like car auctions that are put on by police departments, those are all cars that were garnered through civil forfeiture. And the other piece that I'll just briefly mention here, and we're going to give you these slides if you want to look these cases up later, you can, is that in order to enable the war on drugs, they also had to roll back a lot of our constitutional rights. And so a lot of these court cases on here revolve around that. And specifically like the Florida versus Bostic case, they made it incredibly easy to search people without a reason, without them indicating in any way that they need to be searched, without a police officer seeing drugs or anything like that. They, with McCleskey versus Kemp, they made it nearly impossible to sue for discrimination. That case was about the death penalty in Georgia and how it was and still is racially discriminatory. And the Supreme Court essentially said, yes, we see a discriminatory pattern here. We see that Georgia is sentencing Black people to the death penalty like 3 to 4 times more than white people. Yet also, unless you have overt proof, like someone recorded or wrote down, we are going to target Black people for the death penalty, then you can't, then it doesn't count under our discrimination laws. And so that enabled the war on drugs and enabled, discriminatory policies like stop and frisk and things like that to occur without any sort of recourse within the legal system. But Sanna, do you want to talk a little bit more about how this shifted into this militarized policing era?
Yeah, you can go to the next slide. So, so as we mentioned, this helped to shift into the militarized policing era because not only were police departments being incentivized through being able to pretty much repossess and forfeiture people's possessions and property and in many ways investments. So not only were they incentivized in that way, but they also started to receive discounted rates for purchasing different types of military grade equipment. And so if we go back to the slide on governmentality, that image on that slide.
I'm going backwards, sorry.
You're going forward.
Wrong way.
So, okay, so this slide, if we look at this image on the slide, this is an armored vehicle. This is a mine-resistant vehicle that is used by the military in war zones. And this was a vehicle that was purchased by the San Diego Unified School District in 2014. And they got a huge discounted rate on it. Like they only paid a couple $1,000s for it when this vehicle is like over $100,000 to purchase. And what they purchased it for, as you can see, it's painted and it says search and rescue. And so this was purchased to retrieve victims of school shootings in San Diego's Unified School District schools. What's interesting about this purchase is school shootings are very rare in general. The media likes to present them as much higher, occurring at much higher rates than they actually are. Schools are still one of the safest places for young people in our society. And while school shootings have been on the rise, it's still not at a rate that it's alarming and horrific, but schools are still much safer. And in San Diego, in the Unified School District in San Diego, the last school shooting, I don't remember the exact date of it. It was sometime in the early 2000s, definitely before 2010. So, and there'd only been a couple in the past 20 years. And so there was not a huge need for this vehicle, but they were incentivized to get this vehicle. And they used funding that could have gone towards other programs or resources for schools to purchase this vehicle. Also, this vehicle is located and housed at a school in a low-income community of color in San Diego. And they had their ROTC program paint it and decorate the inside of it with pillows and teddy bears, because that's what victims need when they're being rescued from school shootings. What was also interesting about the time that they purchased this vehicle was they were instituting restorative justice in the schools in San Diego, trying to move away from punitive forms of policing and addressing school misconduct, but yet they're militarizing their schools at the same time by purchasing these types of vehicles. So you can go back to the militarization slide. And so what was happening too is we also saw an increase in surveillance, and part of that was we saw it being much more acceptable by the public in response to 9/11. So we saw the Patriot Act passed. We saw continued dispersal of military equipment to local police departments. We saw the use of tanks and militarized gear emerging, especially in the Ferguson uprising. We saw it in Baltimore uprising. This image on the slide is in response to the Boston Marathon bombing, where they initiated martial law, where they were searching for the perpetrators of the bombing who were not white. And so you can see the militarized response. Also, prior to, at one point, I lived in New York and worked for a legal staffing agency on Wall Street. And just walking around Wall Street in New York after 9/11, years after 9/11, you would still see police in this type of, what this image has, this type of militarized gear, just standing guard throughout Wall Street with AK-47s and in SWAT gear. So, and that was a normal daily occurrence years after 9/11, like 10 years after 9/11. So the militarization and increased surveillance of the police became very accepted by society. And this is where you can see, again, the governing through crime ideologies of internalizing these norms of surveillance occurring, and starting to internalize norms of militarizing police occurring as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is our brief but not brief, quick and dirty overview of policing in this country. So again, as we can see, one, Black people and allies have been resisting state control and state violence throughout our entire history. And again, we can see that the roots of policing that still very much connect to today are about controlling Black people and protecting the property of elite white people. And policing has been reformed multiple times already, yet we're still seeing these same issues of both police brutality, but also like vigilante violence continue, and that vigilante violence, being protected by the legal system, like in the cases of George Zimmerman or Gregory, and his name is up here soon, but the two McMichael men who were the ones who recently killed Ahmaud Arbery, and no charges were filed until, that made national news, and then the video was released. So that's kind of these overall themes that we're seeing. So that means that this isn't necessarily a failing system. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And so reforms are typically things that work for systems that aren't functioning as they're supposed to, whereas abolition calls for a completely new system. And so, like I just said, when we think about and talk about abolition, and I'm going to ask Isatou some questions about this in a second as well, as someone who's actively doing this abolitionist work, it extends beyond just policing, because it isn't just a policing problem. It's a whiteness problem. It's a white supremacy problem, right? Oh, Sanna, before I start asking Isatou a bunch of questions, do you want to explain sort of this, why now? Like, why are we seeing, we've seen protests before. We've seen, uprisings against police brutality before, but I keep seeing, I even was watching an interview with Angela Davis this morning, and she was saying, they asked her, like, have you seen anything like this before? You've been doing this for decades. And she said, no, I've never seen anything like this in my life. Like, this moment is different. This moment is special. So do you want to explain just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one reason why this moment is so different from other uprisings and other forms of resistance that we have seen in the past is, one way to help conceptualize it is a term from a social theorist, Pierre Bourdieu, where he talks about the distance from necessity. And so he talks about how those people who have greater social capital share an objective distance from the material urgencies of life. And so they can afford to not pay attention to some social issues because they don't have this urgency and this need and this requirement to work hard or miss work, or the fear of missing work or losing their job would severely impact their ability to reproduce. And when I say reproduce, I don't mean just have babies. I mean reproduce, like being able to feed yourself, house yourself, clothe yourself and your family, or any dependents that you have. And so, so most people, most workers, they can't afford to miss work, or they can't afford to have their jobs threatened and have that threat of losing their job, because they're closer to these material urgencies of life. And so what we're seeing now is there's over 40 million people who have filed for unemployment because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so not only is the COVID-19 pandemic bringing awareness to structural and systemic inequalities and issues in terms of healthcare and the workplace and economics, but also in terms of these other issues that we're seeing now. And people are starting to pay more attention because their livelihoods are at risk. People are hungry. People are struggling right now. And they're stuck at home because of this pandemic. And so we've seen people on TikTok with all these different videos of being bored in the house bored. And so they have this pent-up energy because they're being impacted by these structural and systemic inequalities, even if they are not members of the Black community or other or Indigenous or people of color. So we are starting to see more white people kind of becoming aware of these issues because they are now closer to material urgencies of life. And so prior to this pandemic, it was oftentimes difficult to get lower and working class people to mobilize together because they could not, if they were living paycheck to paycheck or struggling financially, they could not afford to miss work. And so when people would do like this image of blocking the freeway in like the Ferguson uprising or Baltimore uprising, and you would see interviews of people stuck in traffic on the freeway trying to get to work, freaking out because they're like, if I am late to work, I'm going to lose my job. I can't afford to lose my job. I have 3 kids at home. And these were Black people who they were interviewing, who were not able to support these movements at the time because of their material urgency of life and their need to have a job, and they couldn't afford losing their job. Well, that didn't apply to everyone of the lower and working class, because there was a lot of people of the lower and working class during the Ferguson and Baltimore uprisings who were just like, forget that, like, I'm with the movement, like, this is not okay. But when you've seen people on the news questioning these forms of resistance in previous uprisings, a big part of it has to do with their inability to be able to give up a wage, or give up their job, or have their job being threatened. And so that makes, so if we tie in capitalism and economics into individualization and why people have a hard time engaging in collective action, we're not seeing that as much now because, I mean, so many people in the United States are now unemployed and struggling financially and have, in many ways, have the time to learn about these issues if they were privileged enough to not have to deal with these on a daily basis. And so that's why we've been able to see people in the streets and mobilizing and engaging in collective action in a way that we haven't seen in previous eras and previous uprisings.
This reminds me of what Fanon talked about when he said that the revolution will come from like the unemployed, basically the people who are not as collectively involved in the economic system, and that like any movement needs to prioritize and center them. And I think that sort of happened now, but not even intentionally, but it happened because of just our, you know, economic situation with the pandemic. I'm going to ask Isatou some questions now, but Sanna, if you want to pop in also, just, you know, unmute and speak up. So Isatou, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of why abolition and taking steps toward abolition is a more viable option right now as opposed to reform and these calls for reform that we're hearing?
Yeah, so as we've gone through this entire history of policing, you know, we've seen, and Sanna and Angie have talked about all the different ways that police has been reformed. And after police is reformed, the system gets worse. It gets it polices Black people even more. It gets smarter. It gets militarized. And right now, with, well, in any movement, but right now, I think the foundations of our society and what upholds oppression are being exposed a lot more due to COVID. People are realizing that if you don't have a job, the government is not going to really come in for you. The government only gave most people, people who made less than $76,000 a year, only $1,200 for 3 months. And this pandemic is going to continue happening, but people aren't getting the unemployment on time. People have had to struggle and try to figure out if they're going to get unemployment. People, you know, some people haven't even gotten their stimulus checks yet. So the foundations of our system are kind of being exposed a lot more, that the government is not going to pitch in and help when needed, and the government will allow people to die as it has for over 400 years. And I have this analogy of like a home. If a home has an issue with the foundation, that the structure that's holding it up has an issue, we don't just fix the floors or try to fix the wall. We tear down the entire house and rebuild from a brand new structure and create a whole different structure from that. And with systematic racism, the solution is the same. We have to destroy the foundations of this violent system and abolish it to create a new structure, a new system where where the lives of Black people are in danger every single day, where we don't have to worry about if we're going to come home one day, if we don't have to worry about if our family members and friends are going to make it one day, where we can see our lives past what's right now. And we have to rebuild our world with an understanding of the structures that are in place right now and the foundational issues with white supremacy and racial capitalism, and use that knowledge of understanding what the issue is and how it cannot be fixed because it's doing exactly what it was made to do, and use that to help us figure out how we can dream of a future where everyone is liberated, where everyone is free. And abolition is the framework, the theory, and the praxis for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we talk about abolition, and I kind of like alluded to this earlier, but what are we talking about abolishing? Because you're talking about a foundation, so it's obviously, it's more than just policing.
Mhm. Yeah, so policing is upheld by racial capitalism, and racial capitalism is the idea that capitalism, the idea that there are a small amount of people who hold the majority of power and money and market, and where people who are working for those small amount of people are exploited and are their time, labor, and money is exploited. So capitalism is built on slavery. So the idea that Black people, that we still are, and during slavery, were capital and were actual money for slave owners and for the system. So racism and capitalism are together. They're not separate, they're always together. And so the foundational issues with our society is that it's built on racial capitalism. It's built on the idea that Black people are not human, that we are capital, that we are just here to be exploited, to be controlled, and to be used to allow or create white elites to continue to stay in their power. And so that's why there's always so much there's always resistance from oppression.
Mm.
But policing is built on racial capitalism. It's built on white supremacy, because white supremacy is what created racial capitalism. It's built on imperialism. So the idea that Western nations like the UK, France, the United States exploits and colonize Black and brown countries and peoples in the global South. It's also built on transphobia, homophobia, ableism, because if you're not able to work, then you have no value in this society. Photophobia, which is built on anti-Blackness, and all other forms of systematic violence. And when we say we want to defund the police, abolish the police, we have to also abolish everything else that upholds that as well. An abolition is a theory and it's a practice. It's a praxis. So it's turning your theory into action. And a framework that calls for the complete eradication of violence towards Black people, any system that was built on anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
And that also includes the prison-industrial complex, as Angie and Sanna talked about earlier, with convict leasing being an early form of the prison-industrial complex, and that's an essential part of capitalism. It's an essential part of policing. It's essential part of our legal system. And with abolition, we want to build a future that is not carceral, that doesn't depend on prisons, that doesn't depend on punishment and punitive, and gives people what they need so we don't have to worry about crime. Because I'll talk about that later, but crime comes from people not having their essentials. And and this also, the abolishment of our system also includes our educational system. People not having sufficient education, our medical industrial complex, companies making money off of people being sick and not, providing cures to things that have existed in places like, for example, Cuba has a vaccine for HIV. We don't have that here. When we could totally have access to that, and people don't have to die from that, but companies make money off of people dying, specifically poor and Black and brown people dying. And abolishment of Black people not ever feeling safe and not ever feeling free and not having security.
Yeah, absolutely. So all three of us actually follow the work of Miriam Cabo, who's one amazing abolitionist organizer and has been talking about abolition for decades, and just recently had a piece in the New York Times about abolition, so like this week. So I I recommend checking that out. But Isatou, can you go over, she offered these questions in like 2014 in terms of a way to evaluate proposed police reforms. And I think they just lay out really clearly, because we're seeing, you know, a lot of different proposals right now. And some reforms are steps towards abolition and some are not. And so she offered this framework to kind of evaluate that. And I was wondering if you could go over that a little bit.
Yeah, so these are 4 questions that, as Angie said, kind of can divide between reformist things that uphold policing in our system and gives police actually more power, or abolition reforms and steps towards abolition. So steps towards giving police or taking away power from police. So a main part of this is money, and money is capital, and money is funding, and money is what gives police departments across our country power to do the things that they do, and to get away with it, because there is no punishment for what police officers do. So one of the questions is, are the proposed reforms allocating more money to the police? Are the proposed reforms advocating for more police and policing? So examples, so words like community policing, which Sanna and Angie talked about earlier, as community policing was a era of policing that led to the war on drugs and led to militarization of the police. So I know community policing is coming up a lot right now as well, and that is, as we've seen with history, and history repeats itself, is that if community policing is a reform that gets, you know, enacted in police departments across our state, that's just going to give police more power, allow police to spend more time in Black and brown neighborhoods and do more harm and destruction and murder people without any type of punishment at all, because the system is not going to punish someone for doing what the system wants them to do. Mm-hmm. And are the proposed reforms primarily technology focused? So is technology going to be used to try to hold cops accountable? And as we've seen, you know, with past murders of Black people, body cam videos do come out, and that doesn't change what happens to police officers within the legal system. Police officers can take off body cams. And technology is also an essential part of surveillance of people, surveillance of organizers, surveillance of Black people, surveillance of poor people, surveillance of brown people. And final question is, which I think is really, really important, are the proposed reforms focused on individual dialogues with individual cops? And will these dialogues be funded with tax dollars? So this kind of touches on racial sensitivity trainings, and trying to fix issues with individual cops. And really, the issue is not individual cops. I mean, it is, but that's not the only issue. It's the system that creates them, the system that upholds them, the system that is behind everything that they do. Mm-hmm. So trying to reform a bad cop isn't going to fix an entire system.
Absolutely. And then these next 2 slides, we're going to make the slides available for y'all, so I'm going to just click through them quickly. But and this is also available on the Critical Resistance website. But they took Mariam Kaba's questions and then broke down different proposals that we're seeing right now and in the past few years about what we could do. And they kind of go through her questions and answer, like, does this reduce police funding? Does this, et cetera, et cetera. So like I said, we'll get the slides to you. So I encourage you to read through these, because I think they did an amazing job with this, and it's also available on their website. So Isatou, we've been hearing a lot of people talk about defunding the police, particularly in the past 2 weeks. and seeing people use it in very different ways. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what defunding the police means.
Yeah, so earlier I talked about how money is capital and money is power. And so that is what, when organizers who have been doing this work for a long time have been pushing defund the police campaigns for years and years, that's what it's getting to. The idea that money is what is giving these police departments the ammo, and literally and figuratively the ammo to do all the things that they do and to protect them. So how are police departments funded? So they're funded by local government, state government, and federal government. So they get 3 types of funding. And for most cities, bigger cities, the majority of their funding goes to police departments instead of education, healthcare, housing for unhoused people, or and for example, which is still shocks me to see this day, but Chicago's police department funding for 2020 was $1.7 billion to one department of police. So imagine the damage that they're going to do with that money this year, and that they have been doing with that money this year, when that money can go to building grocery stores
School.
in neighborhoods, like building, like to schools, to funding schools, because school funding is based on what people in that area make. So rich white people who live in rich white neighborhoods have so much more funding towards their schools because they make so much more money, but lower income neighborhoods aren't making that much money, so their tax dollars that are significantly lower than richer neighborhoods are going to schools that aren't being, funded by the state. And a lot of the money, the majority, all of the money that is used towards police departments across our nation can be put into communities, and can be put into communities with communities deciding where that money goes, not the government deciding where that money goes. And defund the police means put at organizers being the center of this, organizers and communities, pushing politicians to decrease police budgets within a certain amount of time until the police budget is 0. So it's not trying to get the police budget to like 1/4 of what it was or half of what it was. The end goal of defunding the police within this specific campaign is to get police budgets to 0. This also includes divesting from police militarization programs. So here in Atlanta, our mayor, Keisha Bottoms, created a program called GILLY with Georgia State University, where this program brings Israeli military, because our government and Israel have a very tight relationship, bringing Israeli military forces to Atlanta to train police officers in new tactics. In this relationship really shows the relationship between Palestinians in Palestine and across the world, and Black Americans, and how our struggles are very much connected, and that neither of us can be free until all of us are. And tactics like kettling that we've seen a lot across the country, we've seen a lot here in Atlanta, was learned from the Israeli military. And we want to stop those relationships. We don't want pension for police officers, and no new hires of police officers either, because if a police department is hiring new police officers, they have to make more money, and they need more funding to do that. And a suspension of paid administrative leave for police officers. So when a Black or brown person is murdered by the state, and if there's a lot of national outcry about it, or local outcry about it, as there usually is, Police officers are not sentenced to jail. They're typically not fired. They usually are moved to a different precinct, or they are given paid administrative leave until the mobilization for their incarceration or firing is done, and then they go back to work. But during that entire time, while people are protesting and trying to get them fired, and trying to get justice for people, they're making money while they're sitting at home, while people who are working every day can barely survive. And defunding the police is not the end goal of ending white supremacy or ending policing, because even though policing or police departments, will be defunded, that doesn't mean that the idea of policing is completely done or eradicated. And this is what Miriam Kaba was talking about in her piece that she just released yesterday, that Angie was talking about earlier. She was talking about abolishing the idea of policing, abolishing the idea that we need to police other people, and the idea that white vigilantes need to always police Black people. So with George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery and the McMichael brothers, they went out of their way to police Black people just living while being Black. And we want to abolish the idea of policing as well. And I think that's really crucial in this time where reform is being pushed and pushed, and and defunding is being co-opted in real time as well. But to wrap that up, defunding the police is a crucial first step of abolition. It's not the end goal, because abolition and abolishing this entire system, so every part of the system, is the end goal, and defunding the police can get us there. And it's in this time but is realistic, and it is happening. In Minneapolis, there have been organizations who have been pushing for defunding of the Minneapolis Police Department for years, and their city council a couple of days ago voted to disband their police department and work towards more community-based approaches. And politicians will say things that doesn't mean it's followed through, so organizers are going to have to do a lot of work to make sure that happens. But it's starting to happen in this country, and it's definitely possible. Abolition is so radically different from the world we live in now, but we're seeing steps towards that, and it's feeling a lot more real for people. And I think this piece of seeing it happen kind of in real time also connects to what Angela Davis was talking about, and that interview that she did about how she's never seen something like this before, and this is a really special time, and we should be doing all that we can do to fight for liberation for people and fight for a future that is free of all this violence and chaos.
Yeah.
And this work has predominantly been done by Black women abolitionists, and we have to do justice for them and justice for abolitionists throughout time, and Black people who have lost their lives because of the state. We have to do justice for them and honor for them by staying true to what defunding the police and abolition actually is, and not listening to politicians who didn't know what this, or who didn't know what this was, who don't know what this is, and are trying to co-opt it into reform so that they stay in their positions of power and the status quo does not change at all.
Yeah, so true. I'm wondering if we can go over Well, a few things. There's always questions that come up when you start to talk about abolition, you start to talk about defunding the police. So one that I hear all the time is this one. So like, what do we do with that funding? What else will we do with it if we defund the police?
Yeah, so over the past couple of years, abolitionist orgs and people have created a strategy called divest and invest. So it's divesting money from the police and using that funding specifically to invest in community-led public safety. So communities deciding what public safety looks like for them, what they need in their communities, not people telling them what they think they need. And this can look like providing housing for everyone, having equal and comprehensive education that teaches children everything that they need to know, and not just a small part that upholds our system and doesn't challenge it. Ensuring that every neighborhood has access to healthy foods and grocery stores, and any other actions that center health and safety for marginalized communities. Because an essential part of white supremacy is violence and ensuring that Black people are not safe, that the violence of Black people and the violence of Black people is what upholds white supremacy. So completely doing the opposite of that and centering safety and health for people. And there have been Black-led abolitionist organizations that have been doing this work for a long time, and it's important in this moment to listen to them, not to listen to people who have power, who maybe are Black and have a lot of money and we're already in the spotlight, but don't know about don't know about abolition, or are actively not pursuing this, or actively not doing work towards this, like a lot of mayors are, and centering their voices, centering the voices of Black-led abolitionist organizations and Black abolitionists during this moment, because the uprisings are Black-led, and it's important to center our voices, because so many of the time, and we're seeing it right now, where our voices are not being heard at all. They're being silenced and co-opted.
Absolutely. So what about the question of, when you start to talk about abolishing the police, one of the first two questions usually gets asked is, what about crime? What would happen then? How do we handle crime if there's no police?
Yeah, so crime crime is a symptom of our system. It's a symptom of white supremacy. It's a system of racial capitalism. Because the whole idea of capitalism is that you deprive a lot of people of money so that a small amount of people can get the majority of the money. So in our system, people are deprived of their basic needs. They're deprived of their essential needs. And that is why quote unquote crime occurs, because they aren't given the things, aren't provided the things that they need, and they have to work 20 times, 30 times as hard to try to get those, and still are not reached those things. And the idea that, and asking this question also assumes that police stop crime, and that policing is an effective way to reduce crime, when it's not, because police aren't a preventative measure. They come in after a crime has happened, and they usually don't actually address what happened, make things worse, or escalate the situation as well. And research has been done that policing doesn't correlate to crime reduction, and in fact that targeting policing of Black and brown communities actually increases crime by decreasing community cohesion, and having people with guns and all this power in your community every single day, it's terrifying, and it leads to increased crime as well. And in an abolition future, crime will be addressed because everyone will have their fundamental needs, and so much more. Abolition isn't based on depriving people of what they need. It's based on asking people what they need and centering that as well. And invest plans include funding for social programs that have been proven to reduce crime.
Yeah.
So centering health and safety, which is not what our system does, and it's not what policing does. And police and our system only does that for white people, typically white rich people.
Right. And then the other question that typically comes up is about particularly like violent crime, right? So like, what about sexual abuse or people who sexually assault others? What about murder? Things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, police officers and cops are have some of the highest rates for abusing people and being sexually abusive towards people. So calling the cops, are asking for a legal system to hold racists or murderers accountable. It doesn't really happen, and when it does, it happens in cases where, like what we talked about earlier, with the majority of like white women using their victimization and their whiteness and their womenness to lie about Black men. And that is usually when our legal system will, uphold that and hold people who are innocent accountable. But 99% of people who commit sexual assault don't spend a day in jail. Our system is not a way to address sexual abuse at all, because our system is based on sexism and based on the idea that masculinity is so much more important and powerful than femininity. In abolition, there is a space for people who harm others to be isolated until they are no longer in danger to other people. So it doesn't look like our carceral system now. It doesn't look like putting people in cages, but within abolition and within transformative justice, there are things put in place to make sure that harm does not continue if it does happen. And transformative justice is an abolition framework of addressing harm that focuses on community and uses community instead of our legal system, and centers the healing and the needs and the wants of victims, and what they want and what they need. And transformative justice is a framework that many abolitionists are using right now, and they use instead of our legal system.
Yeah. And so even after you answer all those questions, sometimes people still have a hard time kind of envisioning a world without police. So how would you respond to someone in that kind of a situation?
Yeah, I would respond that abolition takes creativity that we all have. It's an untapped creativity that has been suppressed by our system. Our system doesn't want us to think of a world outside of this. That's why every time there's resistance to oppression, there's pushback from our system. And centering creativity and allowing yourself to dream and giving yourself space to dream of what you want to see in this world and how you want people to be free and liberated. And envisioning and kind of building this in real time and in real life too is thinking of how you define public safety and what community is for you. So here are a couple questions that I created that were helpful for me when kind of thinking of this, and are some questions that a lot of abolitionist organizers kind of use within our spaces as well, because we want to replicate and create the worlds that we want to see within our spaces and within our everyday too. Because abolition is a framework you can use every day as well, not just this big thing of like, I have to work up to this, which we are working up to it, but it's also something that you implement in your everyday as well. So thinking of who or what ensures your safety every day, and who is in your community care network. So who do you lean on when you need help? Who can lean on you when they need help? And some kind of more concrete questions are, if you're harmed, 2 or 3 people that you would call to help you, to be your safety. And if and identifying, the gaps within our government and the gaps that our government leaves, then public safety. So thinking of, if what we had right now like didn't exist, how would you want public safety to be? Or what gaps are you thinking, or what gaps do you see that the government is leaving within public safety? Well,
Yeah. And so if we get through all those questions and someone is convinced, usually the next question that I hear is, okay, well, what do I do? Like, how do I get involved in abolitionist work? Because that seems like such a huge leap, right? How would you respond to that?
yeah, I was just reading and learning about abolition, and as like the basis of this work, and like the reading never stops. You continue reading as you go. I have so many books on my list, and I'm sure Andrew does too. I'm sure Sanna does too. Of like books that we want to read to help to equip ourselves with this. And as people keep writing and writing about abolition and futures that they want to see, we keep reading about it. And learning about revolutionary moments that have happened in our history, not just within the United States, but also outside of the United States, because creating an abolitionist world isn't just focused on the United States. It's focused on creating that world for everyone as well, especially considering that the United States is an imperialist nation and has destroyed countries and lives across this world and is continuing to do that. So learning about the Haitian Revolution, learning about Angola, reading works by Angela Davis, who is a revolutionary and a pioneer of, the abolishment of the prison industrial complex, who has been alive for 4 decades, and is still alive now, and is still doing work and writing and talking to people about this stuff, and learning about the Black Panther Party, and just learning about history and what has been done, and what can be done. And that can help kind of build the foundations of what has been done, what can be done, and how we can learn from those movements, and what we can do better from those movements as well. And finding local Black-led abolitionist organizations in their area. I'm sure they exist all over this country, even if you're in like a tiny town. And learning about the work that they're pushing and how they're trying to build a future of abolition. So how they're pushing mutual aid work, or have created and are pushing defund the police campaigns, how they're pushing jail closure campaigns and free them all campaigns of freeing all incarcerated people, and plugging into their work how you can, and supporting them how you can, because they've been doing this work for a long time. And not once, because I think this is going to be a sustained moment, but if the mobilization of these uprisings stop or take a pause, they'll be the ones still doing the work on the ground. And also thinking about like your everyday actions and how you're centering safety and health and healing in your everyday interactions with your friends and your family and new people that you meet. And also think of alternatives to not calling the police. And those are some solid ways that can really help kind of build an abolition world for you, within your mind, so that it can be built here in real time.
I think about Miriam Kaba years ago said something along the lines of, abolition starts right where you are. And she gave some examples, and the ones that obviously resonated with me were about teaching, but she was talking about how we have a school to prison pipeline. And when people talk about that, it's usually about K through 12 school, but that extends to higher ed. And, when I was where you were at Georgia State, and in most schools, if there's like a disruptive student, the policy is to send the campus police, right? Black and brown students on campuses across the country experience harassment from police even while they're on campuses. But also Black and brown students, especially low-income Black and brown students, take out more in student loans and are less likely to finish because they get pushed out of higher ed, and then they can't get the jobs that require a BA, but they have a bunch of student loan debt. So like thinking about what you can do in your everyday to center the health and safety of the Black and brown people that are around you. And so for me, it was like a big one was not only thinking about things like, what could I do besides call the police if, something is going on, but also what can I do for my students right now to make sure that they're safe and they're healthy and they can stay here and continue their education without feeling, like they are not wanted here. And so that I just wanted to give that as an example for me in terms of how I think about that being a very everyday thing. It's a big idea, abolition, but it's also really like micro level.
Yeah.
In terms of what we do.
And thinking about how when, I was one of your students and how we felt so cared for and how that was so rare for a lot of us, for most of us, and how people were always talking to you. They wanted to hang out with you. We appreciated the way you treated us and how you gave us leeway, and how people appreciate that. Like we live in a world that doesn't center those things, and implementing that in your everyday is like a real time kind of seeing of like how this world can be outside of just your interaction with this one person or your interaction with these few people, but how an entire world can kind of be where everyone kind of has that feeling of, oh, this person cares about me. Oh, I'm not just a worker. I'm not just a student. I'm not just a body. Like I'm someone who also matters as well. And that's so important when building a world like this or building a future like this, and really centering community and cohesiveness as well, and looking out for each other, and looking out for yourself and looking out for the people around you.
Yeah. I hear that so often that like students feeling cared for is rare, like from students. Or I was passing along a job opportunity to a former student that was right in line with what he just got his MPH. So it's right in line with what he just is focused on. And he's like, I've only had literally 2 teachers ever that show this level of care for me, and you're one of them. And my response was like, he was thanking me, and I'm like, I don't need to be thanked for, you should feel cared for by everyone in your life, and you should definitely feel cared for by every teacher. Like that's a huge part of our job. And it's not to me, it's like infuriating when people talk about it being rare, because it's just not something that should be rare. I mean, I understand our systems create it, and the ways that white supremacy and patriarchy are embedded in our systems is what creates that. But individuals have the power to change that, right now.
Yeah, exactly. And that touches on how like we have so much more power than we think. So there's a reason why our government tries to suppress us and tries to push down like polyed and certain movements in history, because we have a lot of power, and that's been shown in the past, and that's being shown right now, that we have so much power, and that each individual person has so much power too, and to not forget that in your everyday interactions, and to not forget that when uprisings are happening as well, that we can implement the change that we want to see.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say to someone who says this question, how do we create a new system?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to support an org who is doing this work, or join an organization who is doing this abolition work, and of defunding the police work, because that's where grassroots organizations is where change is really kind of pushed, and that's a center of what organizations are supposed to be doing. So finding ways that you can plug into that work and support them, or join if you can. And like if if you're not Black and you want to support a Black-led abolition org, ask them, like reach out to them and ask them what they need, if they need any money, and if you can support that to do that. And if you can't, ask them what skills that they might need, because we all have a purpose in this, and we all have a role in this, and everyone's role is different. And plugging into and asking the people who have been doing this work for years and years, and are going to continue doing this work, asking them what they need, because I know right now a lot of local organizations need a lot, and need a lot of help. So plugging into that, and if you're doing work, because there's a lot of work that you can do from home. You don't, like protests are really important and they're essential, but if you can't go out because we are in a pandemic, where can't go out because of things with the police. Like everyone has a different level of that, but there's a lot of work that you can do from home with supporting organizations, and that can be from supporting digital comms for organizations, distributing poly-ed information, calling police departments, calling mayors and DAs, and demanding answers and change from them, and making sure that you're staying aware and during this time, because it's not just a couple of months and then it ends, because this is Black people's every day. These are our everydays. Like, this never leaves my mind. It's always there, and I can't, like, it's not a hashtag, it's not like a couple of Instagram posts. Like, staying involved in this movement even when there's not all of this mobilization happening, and realizing that revolutions they're not a one-time event. They're sustained, they keep going. It's not just one thing that happens and then everything's done. We have to work up to that. We have to, while we're in that, we have to do a lot of work to keep that happening, to win. And then once the system is abolished, it's creating a new one and doing work there is too. But I'm saying work, but I don't see it as work. It just kind of seems like, for me, it feels like something I have to do, and it doesn't feel like work. Pushing towards liberation for oppressed people, and for a world where we don't have to worry as much as we do. Can kind of take a breath of fresh air, and that's it. It's not a moment, it's a lifetime, and it's a life of that. And
yeah. So we kind of, the three of us, put together some things that you could watch and read, and then Isatou thankfully added places where we can buy those things that are not Amazon. And like I said, I'm going to give you these slides so you'll have this information, so you don't have to try to hurry and scramble and write them down now.